So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our second edition of What Happens Next, a series that we've been doing since April, where we've been speaking to various different leaders and artists from various capacities. Today, we have the fantastic Jonathan Kennedy from the British Council. He recently took this position last February of the Director of Arts, and he's based out of Delhi. Jonathan, thank you for joining us on this Friday evening.
Hi. Thanks, Shreya. Delightful to be here.
We're so happy you have filled this position we were all like, okay, who's going to become the new arts director? So we're really happy to see. And we were just looking through before this interview, this fantastic work that you've been doing from an arts manager, from leadership to strategic planning to business development to fundraising. So we're so happy you're able to bring all of those experiences to India and to the British Council, an organization that we are very close to as well.
Great. Well, would it be useful if I just talk a little about my background first then?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
So, and then we'll talk about our work perhaps in India. So, my background is primarily in theatre in the UK. Mm-hmm. I worked for 10, 11 years at Wimbledon Theatre, which is a commercial theatre that seats about 1,600 people, with no public subsidy and all based upon what we earned from ticketing. So that was good discipline in understanding the commercial side of theatre and of the arts industry. Mm. And from there I moved to an arts centre in London called Croydon Clock Tower, which was publicly funded by the local authority and local taxes. So a very different kind of business model. And an art centre where there was a cinema and a theatre and a gallery space and a range of art forms. And then I moved from there, and I was at 12 years, I think, at Tara Arts, again in London, which was the first British Asian, British Indian, depending on the semantics, theatre company in the UK, founded in 1977 by artistic director Jatinder Verma. Mm-hmm. I was the artistic director just up until the end of last year, so for 40 plus years.
Wow.
Founder was leading the company, and I joined for 12 years and was there just before I left to move to India and to the British Council. Mm. And my role here is really to look at all of our programme work across India and to look at it on several layers, I guess. How we work with governments, we work with the arts sector, and then how we work with audiences. But really, primarily, our focus is how we work with the arts sector and then governments in terms of what that means in terms of strategy and policy level kind of conversations. Yeah. We focused our work very squarely around broadly the creative economy in two specific areas. One is in festivals and one is in crafts. Festivals because we saw up until about 2018 some very thorough research that talked about the growth of the festival sector in India. And of course, there are the big players like JLFs and the Tata Lit Lives and all those big hitters. But all of the younger festivals that have started up also represent something of the entrepreneurial spirit and enterprise economy in the arts sector in India. And both together, the emerging and the established, have something to say to support each other. So our programme there has been really about how we can support the emerging festival sector on many levels, and how we can use established networks in the UK and in India to enable the festival sector to get stronger and to work through what was a very different situation 6 months ago from the situation that we are facing now in the midst of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And our crafts work is really focused on kind of ground up work. So again, strengthening the work of the craft sector, sometimes, and it's kind of thematic. So we're looking very specifically about women in crafts, and we're looking at the kind of crafts enterprise and crafts tourism. Tourism in terms of inbound and international, how we can reach a market
Right.
enable livelihoods of the crafts workers in India. But again, a combination of India and UK expertise working together to support each other.
That's quite fantastic. So India is quite broad too, right? Like that, especially in terms of craft, right? Each state is quite varied. So how do you allocate your resources? I'm just curious in terms of planning.
It's a good question because the craft sector in India is so massive and so disparate in terms of it's in the cities, but it's also in the countryside. Yeah. It's in very remote parts of India that are hard to reach. So when we understood the scale of the craft sector in India, and then our programs, we really focused in what can we pragmatically, what can we do to make a difference without trying to do too many things too thinly, because we'll then kind of miss the mark. So we responded by looking at themes and looking at where we can see we can make a difference from our British Council expertise, and also where the UK has something to offer that is that adds additional value to what is also already very lively in terms of the craft sector in India. And we made a grants program. So effectively, it enabled us not to be too directive, open up these themes and go, if your work you want to develop further, can match into these themes that we are thinking are important for us as an organisation and important in terms of where we can see India has an awful lot of skill and how we can enable that just to progress further. We put that as an approach rather than us steering things, and then enable organisations to really respond to those themes. And that's what we did. And this was last autumn, and we had a huge number of applications. Inevitably, we couldn't fulfil anywhere close to those we wanted to do, but it's just down to our resources to enable us to do that.
Absolutely. I think that's a really interesting way of approaching it through themes, right? And also helps funnel in certain resources and funds towards empowering, smaller groups. And I think working at the grassroots level is definitely the way to go with crafts, right? Because it's so widespread and everybody needs support with crafts. And it's a question of time before, in the next 10 years, I don't know how much of it we might even be alive if we don't support it now. So that's quite fantastic. I just want to go back 1 minute to what you were talking about, your previous experience at Wimbledon, at Tara, etc. And which we were talking about earlier too, is it's quite, India is a different market, it's a different way of thinking, everything is, it's a different ballgame altogether. What made you shift from, being in London, being in Tara and continuing your work as an executive director to being director of arts in India?
So I guess what was the big motivation was that for 12 years I'd been working for Tara Arts. We've been producing lots of theatre that had Indian artists or British Indian family. I mean, families isn't the right term. So we were working with actors and writers in the UK. Families were grandparents moved from India, but they're young artists now or established artists now, as we work with many who are also very big hitters in the UK, but whose family memory was of India, albeit they may have been born in the UK. Yeah. So I had a handle on India from the artists that we worked with and the plays that we commissioned and the writers that we did and the adaptations of the classics that we did, but it was third hand. It was never from actually being in the country and really understanding or getting to understand the culture from the inside. When this came up, it was too much of something not to want to apply for, because I know that I've been here for the best part of a year and a half. My 12 years at Tara, whilst it's very different and the scale, of course, is massive in terms of the scale of what we can do and the scale of the country, but understanding something of the contemporary culture of India and the classical traditions of India, I kind of had a handle on it from my work at Tara. So actually it didn't seem or feel too alien when I first arrived. It's just getting to grips with the sheer scale of India that is a whole other level from the UK.
Yeah. Absolutely. And how has it been? I think since last February. And it's
Well, as you mean, it's very different now from last year.
exactly.
When I was here on my second day, I thought, this feels like home. I understand people and its complexities and the entrepreneurial spirit and the traditions. And so I thought, oh yes, whilst it's a very different climate and all of those things that you have to adjust to in terms of the extreme heat and then the extreme rain and all of that, and the scale of traveling when we were able to travel, meet the extraordinary artists of India who are there, and the arts managers who are working on the ground and at senior levels as well. So that felt, of course, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. And you're kind of navigating both, really, to adjust to the scale and the climate, but then really just listen and learn and just use those early weeks to absorb and then adapt how we look to what we do. And of course, now it's very different, given that all across the world and across India, all working from home. So we're having to keep our work rolling and not be cowed by it, really. Look to how we adapt and just take the spirit that is alive in terms of entrepreneurs and enterprise economy that has to adapt. You can't sit on your laurels because you have to adapt to conditions all the time. It's in the nature of artists in many ways to be adaptable and to be inventive. It's part of what makes an artist be an artist. Of course, this is extreme, and I don't in any way undervalue the effect of the pandemic. Is very different from being adaptable in the normal times, because this is a very different set of circumstances that we are living through now, and I expect we'll continue to live through, and having to find ways of learning how to support and enable and strengthen the sector whilst we're all learning at the same time, including the British Council.
Which, very well said, absolutely, is how to support, enable, and implement, right, that change. Whereas, because theoretically we say, okay, we can do X, Y, Z to survive or to generate revenue, but actually implementing that while we're all, social distancing or working from home in various different time sectors, quite complicated. But when I was just thinking, what we know the British Council for, which is known for funding, for collaboration, for exchange, right? And I've had the privilege of seeing so many fantastic performances thanks to the work British Council does. And I was just wondering how is the council adapting right now, and especially with regards to funding, right? Because I know a lot of my clients that we were ourselves planning to apply for some of the funds, especially in the craft sector. So any plans? I know it's obviously put on hold right now, but any idea of how things are going?
Sure. Well, and I guess to go back to perhaps we were known for certain things like the performances, which of course are very important in terms of the memory of the British Council, but also how we look now at our work, about what's important is the skills and the capacity development that we can really focus on, and how we can use expertise both UK and India to enable that capacity and skills development, from which will have come more performance-based work. What our grants program was about, that we had last autumn, we had a program with our colleagues in Wales and India to bring together artists and festivals to create some art that can then tour into festivals in Wales and in India. And we hope that program will continue into the autumn, albeit those projects are actually also at the moment can't quite progress as they had planned to because they can't travel. So, part of also what we are doing is looking at how we can think digitally and use collaborations there to enable at least some of the skills and the conversations and the insight also bring into the conversations now. Because I think there are several layers to how we can look at digital as to performance work, and how we can use digital to enable the skilling whilst all in this lockdown scenario. And of course, we've all gone online and all gone lots of webinars, and to an extent, you can also saturate that as we're all doing this. But I think what we are focused on is ensuring that the quality of the speakers, the quality of the insight, we really work very hard before we get to the point of doing the sessions to ensure it feels very much relevant to the times that we're living through. And that if we look at on several layers to say digital, and I think we're all grappling with it at the moment. There's digital in terms of how you create art and how you consume it and how you distribute it. At the moment, we're looking at that across all of our festivals work on the grounds that we can see festivals have gone online. The Jaipur Literature Festival has gone online with Brave New World. We can see Serendipity Arts Festival is doing lots of work online. And that's really about sharing what would be ordinarily in a festival context, but sharing it on a digital platform. So that's how you're kind of consuming and producing the work. There's also artists and festivals in India, such as Unbox and iMyth Festival, who again are used to creating work that is made for digital, as opposed to made for being in a venue. And sometimes it works in both contexts. Similarly, so with, say, Kochi Biennale, where you can make work that is physical and work that is installation that has a digital component to it. So artists are used to working across platforms that are both live, physical, and digital. Seeing what does that mean in terms of the current situation, then how do you consume it, and how do you distribute it, and how, of course, in the current context, do you leverage that to also make income from it? And that's a harder conversation. All looking at that at the moment. So I don't think we have the answers to that. Part of it opening up the conversations will give us something that we can think about and to see how we can then support in terms of bringing together some of that thinking as well. So that's part of our thinking at the moment, is how can we learn from what's going on and then networks to enable artists to earn at the moment. And then we think about some of the work that the sector is doing in the UK and in India for sure in terms of income. In some ways, it's about emergency income for artists. We've been doing a piece of research that we'll be launching in the next 10 days or so, called Taking the Temperature. It's really looking at what's been the response to the sector and individuals and organisations. What are they doing now? What do we learn from this in terms of the risks around the sector and how it may look very different in a year's time, but also what is going on from within the sector and from within various relief packages are coming from, say, the Kerala government.
Absolutely.
Extraordinary work in terms of supporting artists. And then, say, from within the sector, such as the Staying Alive project, that again is about enabling and supporting from within the artists' community for artists as well, which I think is very different from, say, how the UK sector is, because it's very differently structured. There's one government in the UK. There are the devolved nations, which also have arts programs. You can look at England. You also look at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. That is one department that looks at the whole of the UK. And then you have Scotland, and Northern Ireland and Wales that also have their devolved nations governments that also have arts and culture programs. And then you have Arts Council England, Creative Scotland, Arts Council Wales, and Arts Council Northern Ireland. The mediators between the government funding that goes to those organisations who then distribute support for the arts sector across the UK. And what has happened there at some speed is that those arts councils have adapted their programs that were ordinarily to do with various sectoral projects, and they've created funds that are really about supporting artists as individuals and organizations to get through this moment of crisis. Of course, I think it's easier for seeing how organizations can access funding in the UK, and perhaps individual artists are also vulnerable in the UK as well, because it's harder for them to know how to access funding because it's not part of what they're used to.
Absolutely.
I think they're very similar. It's a very similar story coming through in terms of our initial insight from the research that we're looking at. Mm-hmm. When we launch it, it'll be clearer, but I think we can see for our initial interpretation, there are definitely similar concerns in India and higher risk in terms of what might come in the next 6 months to 9 months in terms of sectors and organizations and individuals remaining within the sector. Whether the natural entrepreneurial spirit will mean that people will adapt and pivot because the infrastructure here is quite different. There are no sort of systemic approaches that enable the organisations in the UK to get through the current lack of business ultimately, because business has stopped because we're all in lockdown. Mm-hmm. We are learning from the research and to see what that means in terms of our understanding, how we can then share that understanding at the moment.
Fantastic. I think there's so many things to take away from what you said there. One of the questions I think which stands out to me most from what you said is everybody's like, when are we going to go back to normal, right? Basically normal business. And one of our other speakers from our series said, why would you want to go back to normal when normal was not perfect, right? So what are what do you foresee, right? From the research that you're doing, but even generally as from your position and from your experience, what do you think will be some of those changes post-COVID, post-pandemic that might happen? Just for an example, we have a project that we do with the Corporation of Chennai and with our clients in public spaces specifically, right? Where we bring arts to public spaces, mainly parks and other grounds and things like that are owned by the government. And this was a completely new sector. And so we had never thought about doing those performances online, right? With a partner who has those same audiences who would come to a public space. And that's what we've shifted, right? But now going forward, we said, okay, even when things open up, we're going to do one event like this online and one in the park versus to doing both in the parks, right? Because we said we have to kind of now acknowledge both spaces, which pre-pandemic many leaders were not acknowledging the digital space as really even a space to be serious about. And now suddenly everything changed in a matter of a few weeks. So that's, for example, how we have adapted or we have changed course a little bit. What kind of systemic changes do you think or do you see happening in India or the UK because of this pandemic to hopefully make it better than what we were before?
I think you make your opening kind of gambit was really, why would you go back to something when there's another way of looking at things? And that's not to undervalue what we all, especially from those of us who come from the kind of performing arts, are used to, which is used to being in a theatre, or used to being in a cinema, or used to being in a gallery, or used to being in a museum, where it's tangible. These things really matter to those of us who have come from that background. And I think what those institutions will probably, as you're saying, want to do and need to do is adapt the model. Without quite knowing what that model might look like yet, because we're all learning it on the ground. So we haven't got those fixed answers yet. This is a moment, I guess, a moment of kind of reflection, a moment of rethinking, and a moment of reinvention. And something really important that you talked about when you talked about partnerships and partnership working. By working together, we're all working together, but working together when we can finally be in rooms together would be a really useful way of also understanding that collaboration brings strength and brings a sense of pooling of resources, but also learning from each other and then how we adapt. And I think something around digital being a really useful tool to that, because it's forced us all to do that. Mm-hmm. But I'm all learning on the ground from them doing that. So something around collaboration. I also think there is something that we can see is happening already by way of some artists looking to work together. So perhaps there's more informal collaboration that maybe the UK is tied into certain structures like trade unions, those things that by kind of protections and rights around artists or writers or actors or musicians, provide a kind of support network. That formal way of working, I don't think is there in some parts of the sector, so maybe said it is in film, perhaps not in others, but where we can see shifts already happening. And I don't think there's examples actually in the south of Bangalore where there are artist studios who work independently of each other. Now they're starting to look to work together. So a collective voice is also important in terms of campaigning, but also just looking to understand. By understanding we are one and we are not in competition, we are there to actually help each other, will be a really important way of looking to the future. And using this time to do that now, having to work online, let's not lose that sense of collaboration. Mm-hmm. Then what do we do with it longer term by way of looking at what this might look like, either, as you say, by making work together and recarving your business model by not losing the DNA of live, very important, but also how we then can leverage the live to inform the digital. And let's give a real tangible example. If we look at what has happened with NT Live, National Live in the UK, that usually was live performances streamed in cinemas globally across the world as ticketed events that were part of the National Theatre Live, looking at this, and they were doing this the past 10, 12 years. Now, because of lockdown, NT Live is now National Theatre at Home. An archive of those recordings are now being streamed every week across the world. And they're reaching huge numbers, 1 million people a week watching the performances online from the archive that exists. So if you are a museum or a gallery or a theatre and have an archive, leverage it, because part of using that content that you have will also feed into your ability to keep your profile up. And so then, in order when you are open again, haven't gone to ground, you're able to keep rolling and keep talking about what you do. Absolutely. I think for an individual artist, it's much harder. And I really don't want to in any way undervalue the impact of lockdown on those individuals, because it's much harder there to keep functioning, especially if you're at home and you've got your family commitments or you've got your family around you. How do you keep working and keep creating? Mm-hmm. Anyways, artists will always create, but how do you live and earn your rupees to survive in these current conditions? And that's much harder. So when we see really good work going on with the Kerala government, I think in Tamil Nadu as well, in other areas, I think what we want to just is from the British Council is just amplify that work. It's great examples of what is going on that we can just talk about and really understand that. And India's flexibility of working is also an example of what also happened in the UK. So I think there are lessons that we can really learn from both the UK and India, and just talk about that in a bigger way. That's what we hope our research will also do, is combines some of the thinking, really.
For sure. Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And the power of partnership and collaboration and really rethinking the market right now, because right now it's not a question of who has better resources. For once, we all have the same resources. We all have a camera and we all have the internet. We have to survive.
Yeah.
So it's kind of democratized that space of everybody actually having an equal platform. But there are a few artists who we have been working with. We have been consulting for them. Is really they're not comfortable. But creating work during a pandemic is so difficult. I think so many people do it, and immediately others are expected to do it. But I understand for myself, even being a dancer, it's not easy to create when you're going through a pandemic, right? And like you said, it's your family. It's like you're rethinking the way you're living your life, and it's not a normal life, especially because the future is uncertain in many ways. What would you say, or what would be your words of advice for some of these artists who are struggling to put themselves out digitally, number one, or if their art, for example, if it's an installation, or even if they're a theater company but don't have a strong archive or don't have recording that's good enough to just put digitally because it's not going to engage, right? And so not everything is translatable,
absolutely.
Which I'm sure you're aware about. What would be your words of advice for them? Because now it looks like it's going to be another few months of this for sure before people feel safe, because the vaccine is sort of like the bigger solution to the problem. But until then, even if the theater is open, it's a question of where our audience is going to really trust and come out. And do you want to put your audiences, threaten their safety under any circumstances?
Absolutely. I think that there's so many layers to that in terms of an artist's well-being, because in the first place, well-being in terms of your mental health, when you're locked down and dealing with isolation or your family all over you and lack of isolation. It's so complex in terms of people's experiences that they're living through. But I think in terms of well-being, that's absolutely critical. And in fact, there's an organization in Calcutta, Calcutta Sanvad, who've provided a resource just to enable artists as individuals to look after their well-being. That's such a fundamental, because I would also say, in terms of what advice I would say, you were an artist 6 months ago. You're still an artist. You're still an artist. All of those skills and creativity you still have, that really hasn't changed. So whilst the conditions are hard, and there is something around how you deal with that and find a level that enables you to still remember you're an artist, and find a way to find a balance in that, to continue to create. Of course, some art forms are collaborative, so it's harder to be a collaborative artist in theatre making when you're used to being in a rehearsal room together. But a painter, a writer, a craftsperson, a musician, and even in theatre, there are still ways of making theatre together. But it is definitely a harder form to adapt to in the current conditioning of being in lockdown. I would say you hold on to that part of you that is in your DNA as an artist, and you don't lose sight of that, because if you do, then it's much harder to regroup yourself. So I'd say my advice is remember your values as an artist. Don't lose track on those. Look after your well-being, because that's really important in this current scenario as it extends into the summer and beyond, potentially. And then I would say look to work together, and use this time to look to work together. It may feel alien because it's just online conversations, but actually you take from it what you can, and don't try and take all of it. Because don't feel the pressure to take all of it. Take from it what you can, reflect upon it, and then use that time to talk to other fellow artists. And that's when the informal collections are coming together. really tap into that, especially as an individual artist. If you find on the web conversations that it's individuals, or you feel a commonality or an empathy, something that you can tap into, follow up with them. Find a way of calling them later, emailing them, find a way of connecting with them so that you're not feeling alone. And actually these conversations at least help us have that ability that perhaps we wouldn't ordinarily have done in day-to-day strain to keep functioning and keep rolling. So use the time to reflect, look after your well-being, and remember you're an artist still, and keep making. Don't stop making, because if you stop making, then really it's going to be harder.
To start again, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, to reestablish yourself, yeah.
For sure. And I think that's what we've also seen with our own programs and our workshops that we've been doing, is audiences that we knew always existed, but we never really tapped into that because we always had a different way of running a workshop and starting a space and an arts residency, etc. Mm-hmm. And so then when we opened that, and through our workshops, we have people from Paris and New York and London, and just people from all over the world who come, and then suddenly you just realize you have more in common than you thought. And everybody, despite the economy or different sectors, are facing very similar types of problems. And so these new relationships almost in the last 3-4 months have been quite refreshing, like what you've been saying. And I think that's really advice on point. I'm just going to shift tracks a little bit from an artist to being a business owner or an entrepreneur. Like myself and many other friends and colleagues who we almost have like a self-help group, which is what we call a WhatsApp group, where we all just discuss how are we going to face, how do we get out of bed in the morning sometimes also. But really looking at being in a position of a leader is probably even more stressful right now, because it's really a quality of a leader to shift tracks, right? And to navigate, understanding where the new opportunities are. Some people do it really well. Some people have various different opportunities, in front of them, which they have to choose. And it's hard making those choices right now, especially considering this current climate, and as well as our own mental health, right? Because we're not always thinking straight sometimes. So what would be your advice, especially since you, from your position of being a leader, strategic planning, and all the experience that you have, what would be your advice for leaders on shifting tracks and leading in the arts right now?
Gosh, that's a big question.
I know. So all of my questions are big.
So I would say that this is a cycle. It's not forever, and things will return to some sense of normality, albeit we'll have learned a different way of working through this experience. So you have to remember it's not forever, we hope, and that you hold on to your values and your vision for why you established your business, and those things are immutable. Why you make theatre, why you are a dance company, why you run a gallery, why you believe in the heritage of India's museums, why you believe that playing the tabla or working in the contemporary arts or working as a filmmaker, those things are the same. They're absolutely true now and will be true again. And the same point to make about artists. So you hold on to that. Adaptability, pivoting, reinvention. Again, I think this is inevitably what we will all have to do, partly because in some cases organizations are having to reduce their costs. Their costs because of the situation that we're contending with. And that will mean that the sector may look very different in a year's time from now. And we just have to understand that. And we understand that in some cases, cash is king. If you haven't got cash, you have to adapt. Going online is part of that. But as a leader, so adaptability is part of resilience. belief in why you established your business is absolutely, you hold on to that. And you adapt by understanding what you need to do now to ensure that your organization can continue and be able to regroup and refunction in 6 months' time from now, because it will be a longer haul. And that will be down to how you adjust your business, your cash, your overheads, your programs. And then you use this time to build those partnerships that will enable you to restart and reboot. And you leverage those things now on the grounds that you're going to set in some new kinds of parameters and some new foundations in order to be able to restart. And use this moment when we haven't got to be quite so driving it all, to actually use this time to think about it. But there is still a need, as you say, for getting up in the morning and remaining resilient and supporting your team and understanding the welfare of your team all working remotely is also a challenge for them as well. And part of understanding the constraints that you're going through is also what your team is going through, and how you support your organization, your artists, your marketing people, your finance people, all of those who form the ecosystem of your organization and the ecosystem around the organization is really important to understand. We're all going through it. But actually, you as a leader have to have the strength to continue on that basis. And that's tough. It's really tough. And I don't in any way say it's easy. But it's also one that I think we all understand, having run organizations and in my current role, and we have to adapt. And part of, I think, what we did with some of our programs in March when the pandemic was sort of heading towards us, saw lockdown was coming, we took some of our festivals work that would have been done in rooms in Delhi and in Bangalore and in Mumbai and Kolkata and Chennai, and we just took them online. And as you said, we found we reached a whole new audience.
Yep. Exactly.
We had festivals talking about the amazing work of festivals in India, showcasing that. And we had the Berlin Film Festival asking questions on our webinars, because suddenly we were way beyond being in a room in Delhi, and we had the world watching us. Yeah. So actually, we reached 14 different countries on our first 2 editions in March of our festivals, connections, events. That meant that actually we were finding, oh yeah, amazing work of India's festivals is now being showcased across the world. Yeah. Who knew? Yeah. And of course, the art, of course, we all should have known it. We just didn't think that way. So actually, we're all learning on the ground as well, as an organization and from the sector's perspective.
Sure, and I think also now, because everybody's at home, they're also more tuned into the digital space and cued into what's happening. But absolutely, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. I think there's so much to take away. I would have loved to ask 100 more questions, I'm sure, but I think there's a lot to think about. And like you said, I think really introspection and time to slow down and think a little bit more deeper on what we're doing, even as leaders, to make those strong decisions and stand by them. And I think it's always tricky to. This is my biggest problem, is understanding when to start monetizing, right? Because it's such a new space and you don't want to do it too soon, you don't want to do it too late. And yet you still have to build value while you're programming and fighting a pandemic and helping other clients do that as well. And you have to do the same for yourself. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much for your time and for your mind space, really, because I can imagine how much you have on your plate. And to have this conversation and to share your knowledge, really, thank you so much. And I really hope we get a chance to meet in person very soon.
Me too. Well, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure talking about our work at British Council and the important role that India has and the artists of India have in terms of holding on to your work and belief in the work, and because the arts in India represent something so fundamentally important to what makes India such a fantastic country.
Absolutely. And we're so happy to have you here. And leading us through this pandemic.
You're welcome.
In fact, one of your festival connections, I myself attended only because it was online, because earlier it wasn't. And so I was thinking, wow, this is just suddenly you have more work and more events that you have to attend rather before the pandemic. And then now every evening you have something or the other going on online that you can choose, as well as your Pride Festival that I've also been watching on your Instagram and your Facebook, which is fantastic again. So many new, collaborations, things online, which I think is just so much more accessible, and you can watch it from the comfort of your bedroom, and so I'm enjoying that specifically.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. That's great to know.
Super. Thank you, Jonathan. And everybody should follow British Council India page if you haven't already, to figure out all of the fantastic events. And if you haven't already, do fill up their survey as well if you're in the arts community. I think it'll be really good to see some of those results. So thank you, Jonathan. And we'll see you all tomorrow for our next episode of What Happens Next with Pani Kumar, who's a DJ and producer. And he's going to be giving us a little taste of his craft and talking about how DJs are navigating this new space of digital concerts and Zoom parties. So thank you so much, and see you tomorrow.